All right, so here we are. John chapter 18, by way of review, Jesus prayed what is called the high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, bringing a close to that large section of teaching that began in chapter 13 and carried through 14, 15, 16, and now the high priestly prayer in 17. Now we come to chapter 18, and we start with the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, and as recorded in the Gospel of John. And so I'll get us started, reading at verse 1. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. All right? So here we have the story of the betrayal. Some interesting things here. Jesus goes out of the city, leading the disciples out across what is called the Kidron Valley. It's a ravine that is a dry stream most of the year, but it becomes a river in the rainy season, kind of high backyard. On the other side of the ravine is the Mount of Olives, okay? And on its slopes is Gethsemane, which means oil press. We learn its name from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 32. It's simply called a garden here, and they're going to stay in the garden until the mob arrives in verse 4. John probably omitted the story from Matthew, Mark, and Luke to center on the arrest itself. And what we're talking about there is Jesus is going deeper into the garden and the whole, Father, if it be possible, that whole thing. He probably wanted to focus on the arrest. And this leads us to Judas. This was a common meeting place for Jesus. So, Judas knew where it was, and he also knew Jesus would go there first. Over in Luke, the evangelist tells us Jesus and his followers spent every night of Passion Week on the Mount of Olives, likely at this very spot. So we read in John that he stayed at Bethany at the beginning of the week. Now that makes sense because of the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11. But starting Passover night, they were to be in the near vicinity of Jerusalem. So they could stay in Gethsemane there. And so Judas has agreed to betray him so he can be arrested without much fuss, right? And the Sanhedrin sends a detachment of temple police. You see, they have their own police, the temple. That's interesting to me. They got their own police. I look back in the Old Testament, and I just don't see any directives from God on, all right, now, these guys are going to be the police at the temple. But they got them. They've got them. And they've got some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. So there's a company of Roman soldiers that only John adds here. It's pretty interesting. He calls it a cohort, which is technically a battalion of 600 soldiers, but probably not. Probably just a large company. But they would make certain there would be no riots. There would be no riots. And they're said to be carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. At least swords and probably spears as well. So they were armed and ready to go, right? So let's move on now to verse 4. Somebody read verses 4 through 9. This is a great story. Go ahead.
Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke of those whom you gave me. I have lost none.
Okay, so because of its strong supernatural elements, there are some that doubt the historical reliability of this scene, which is only found in John's gospel, okay? It starts with omniscience. It starts with Jesus knowing all that was going to happen to him, right? This is a frequent emphasis all over the Gospel of John. The stress throughout the next chapters is his complete authority over all that is to transpire, including his death and resurrection. Back in chapter 10, Jesus said, no one takes my life from me. I give my life for the sheep, okay? So he takes the initiative and goes out of the grove to meet his feet head on, okay? So Jesus has control of this situation. There's no kiss of greeting from Judas. And then he asks them, who is it you want? And they respond, Jesus of Nazareth. Remember, Nazareth functions almost as a surname, much like Johnson, John's son. That's that's where we get it. Jesus says, I am he. And, on the surface, you're just like, that's me, but there's a lot more going on here with the other I am sayings, chapter 6, 8, and chapter 13. It's almost the equivalent of Jesus saying to them, I, Yahweh, am here. I am here. And so I believe that's exactly what Jesus is saying. Because what happens here is the entire arresting party, John says, of temple police and Roman soldiers drew back and fell to the ground. Right? And the words of Jesus throughout John hold extraordinary power, since he is the voice of God. And so we have these ego eimi sayings in verses 5 and 6. I've already told you, I am he, ego eimi. Right? Some believe it's a little more than several soldiers clumsily tripping over one another. I thought, it's doubtful, okay? It's far more likely that John is creating an ironic scene of theophany. People fall, and theophany is a visitation of God, an experience of God. People fall to the ground when confronted with God's manifest presence. That's what happens, right? Remember Saul in chapter 9 of Acts, when he is confronted by Jesus in the blinding light, he falls to the ground. So that's what's going on here, I believe. They're so shocked, right, that he has to repeat his question. Who is it you're looking for? See, isn't it something? They're coming to get him, and when they get there, he's in control. And when they give him the same answer, he tells them again, hey, I've already told you, I am. So if you're looking for me, then let these guys go. Let these men go. And, it goes back to chapter 17, right? Where he says in verse 12, I have not lost one of those you gave me. This is the only place in John that a non-scriptural statement is seen as fulfilled, right? If you look back at those verses, he says, this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me. It's the only time. And that's amazing to me. Jesus is the Word of God, y'all. He's his living voice. So this makes sense. He's the good shepherd who's watching over and protecting his sheep from the wolves. And soon he will also lay down his life for them. That's something? Wow. All right, let's keep going. Verses 10 through 12.
Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me? Sorry.
That's okay. Can't help it. Okay. Verse 12. You want me to read it? Verse 12?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. And I'll actually read 14. First, they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, a high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Okay, so a lot going on here. Let me just a couple of things here. Malchus, we learned something new here. Slave of the high priest named Malchus. An interested reader of the gospel could check, with an eyewitness. It seems like there's an eyewitness testimony here, because how would they know? How would they know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they could check with them to discover the authenticity of the story. And he has a sword here. The word is Machaira. It was likely a short sword or long knife hidden in Peter's robe. It was something he was carrying concealed. It seems a reckless act with a company of Roman soldiers present, but we must remember that the disciples had no idea of Jesus as Isaiah's suffering servant. They thought Isaiah 52 and 53 spoke of the nation, all right? But Peter was thinking of the Messiah initiating the final war to destroy the nations, right? He undoubtedly expected the armies of heaven to appear as he drew his sword. So Peter took to the offensive. It was clumsy. He may have cut off the ear deliberately. It could be either one, since there is some evidence that a priest who had his ear sliced off would be disqualified from his office. We cannot know for sure, right? So Jesus will have nothing to do with this start of the final war, right? He came as suffering servant, not the king. Not conquering king, what I mean there. So his coming as divine warrior will await the second coming. So he tells Peter, put your sword away. We learn in Luke 22, Jesus heals Malchus. That's one of the most touching scenes for me in The Passion of the Christ, is when Jim Caviezel, who's playing Jesus, he comes over to, he's telling Peter to cut it out. And while he's doing that, he's putting his hand on Malchus's ear, and Malchus is just sitting there, but he puts his hand on his ear, and all is made well. And Malchus, just after the whole company leaves the garden, Malchus is still there, just sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you do with that? I mean, wow. So he does say, put your sword away. And Matthew adds this, all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And that statement probably saved Peter's life. You can see, can't you, Roman soldiers about to impale Peter right there and then. But Jesus does not allow them to do so, right? So anyway, see what else we got here. Throughout John, the hour of destiny is uppermost. He asks the question, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? And of course, it's a symbol of suffering and wrath. Peter has unwittingly placed himself in opposition to God's will, and Jesus will have none of that. All right? So they bind him. And there's a little bit of an echo here for Genesis 22 in the binding of Isaac as well. You can see a little bit of an echo there. Okay. Then we have the trials. So let's pick up. There's nothing really to point out in verses 13 and 14. So let's go ahead and keep reading, y'all. Let's take it down to verse 27, 15 to 27.
15 through 27.
Yes, ma'am.
Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I have said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. That didn't sound right. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed.
Wow.
Yeah.
John is just such a wonderful writer here. Interspersing Peter's denials. Mark, this was in Mark, we'd be talking about another one of those Markan sandwiches, where we have Jesus before the high priest in verses 12 through 14. Then we go to Peter denying Jesus. And then we go back to the high priest questions Jesus. So you've got that sandwich. But then you also have the other denials of Peter. So you kind of have a double decker here, if you will. There's two stories in 4 parts separated, but it's wonderful writing. It keeps you on the edge of your seat. Now, this friend of the high priest that, I've always heard people say, well, it was John, of course. It was John. It had to be John. It had to be the beloved disciple. But let's think about that for a second. How would a lowly Galilean fisherman be a friend of the high priest? He's from Galilee, right? John, James, and John in Galilee.
Mhm.
So it's always been assumed that it's the beloved disciple. Because let's look at it together there. It says, let me make sure I get this right. Yeah. Since Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Well, we always tend to link Peter and John together because, the Gospels do, right? But here it just simply says another disciple. So you passed it to me, Carol.
That's catching.
Yeah, hopefully it won't get to you. Long way down there.
Hope not.
Yeah, I hope not. So when you think about this, other suggestions have been made. They're just suggestions because nobody really knows. Nicodemus. I have this idea that the disciple that gets Peter in is more than likely on the chosen. I like to play these guessing games. I won't know until next season. But I like to play these guessing games. I believe it's going to be Joseph of Arimathea. I think because Joseph is on the council. And so is Nicodemus. But that may be more chosen talking than anything else. But there really is no way to determine who it is because it just says another disciple. So anyway, whoever it was some highfalutin, somebody who knew him. Yeah.
It also had been one of the disciples in the garden with him.
Yeah, quite possibly. So, yeah,
So that would mean there was more than 12 people at the Last Supper.
could have been. I mean, people have suggested that. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So so we don't really know who it is, but the language points to a close friend. John regularly names people like even Malchus, or when he talks about Nicodemus, he names him. The only other unnamed individual is the beloved disciple. So the connection with Peter would point this direction if we, and that's pretty much where most people traditionally land. But moreover, fishermen were not at the bottom of the social scale. And John's father Zebedee had workers under him, indicating some wealth. So a connection with the high priest is not out of the question. And the language here makes it likely that it probably was the beloved disciple. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder where Caiaphas is from, because the priests were changed every so often, didn't it?
Yes, sir.
So it's possible that Caiaphas may have been from Galilee.
He might have been. Yeah, he might have been. Yeah, there's no way to know. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Okay, so Peter gets a challenge from a woman. You aren't one of his disciples. This is significant, for this means that John was known to her as a disciple. John was known to her as a disciple. And there is a double contrast here. Peter's cowardice is not only the opposite of Jesus, but of the beloved disciple too, as he denies any connection. We should note that while Peter does fail Jesus here, he and John are the only two brave enough to come this far. Okay? The rest are hiding, unwilling even to go out into the light of day. Okay? So everybody, it's a cold night, so everybody is standing by the fire. The mention of the charcoal fire, that's anthrakia. It's a historical touch. That's an authentic detail, right? It almost looks like an intimate scene of friends waiting together until we realize the sinister cast in which most are enemies of Jesus. Peter is standing among enemies, afraid for his freedom. There is a turnaround coming at another charcoal fire where Peter will receive forgiveness, but that's a little bit down the road. All right, so Jesus is interrogated. It's a mock trial. It's an emergency trial, but it's a kangaroo court, I think is what they say. This is all being staged. They're trying to get him to Pilate. That's the goal. They got to get a charge against him to get him to Pilate. So all we have here is John marks from Annas to Caiaphas. And the idea is to get him in the morning in front of Pilate. Jesus is, again, he's in control. I have spoken openly. Ask those who have heard me. Often, I wonder sometimes about that gentleman who hit him. I wonder if Jesus said, hey, remember me. So, the superhero in me, the Batman guy in me, had Jesus coming up to that guy and said, you remember me? Bam! But that's not Jesus. That's not Jesus. That's not.
And a part of you makes him maybe want to do that.
Yes, but he's fairly curt here. Jesus is fairly curt here. He says nothing about his disciples, but he centers on his teaching. He says he's taught publicly, and then he gets hit. Right? This was proper. Jesus is just using proper protocol. Ask the people who heard me; they'll know what I said. And this was protocol. Anyone in Jerusalem could answer these questions. But then he gets hit. But Paul, there's a dispute here about Jesus and Paul. Paul gives humble deference when rebuked before the Sanhedrin in Acts 23. But Jesus is, he's not as humble and deferent. But I think that's bad. I think Paul is in a legal trial setting. What they're doing with Paul is legal. It's on the docket. It's there. But Jesus says, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? Well, telling the truth is never a sign of insolence, and he does not call the official a whitewashed wall like Paul did. Remember? Paul gets slapped. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Whoa! Right? Jesus didn't do that. Jesus wants a fair trial, but their animosity is so great, they're not going to give it to him. They're not going to give it to him, right? And these officials are tools of Satan. He goes on the offensive in the light. He stays on the offensive. And then we have the final two denials. Just kind of looking here. This was most definitely the worst moment of Peter's life up to that point, when the rooster crowed. And it was his greatest failure. But in all the Gospels, there's hope for the future. He will be reinstated, and we'll get to there next week. And he will fulfill Jesus' prophetic promise that he will indeed become Peter the Rock. We are so much like him, and we too must realize that in spite of our failures, God is faithful and gives us a similar hope in the future. So long as we keep turning to him, right? All right, let's carry on. Big, long section here with Pontius Pilate. How you doing, Gail? You want to read?
I'll read.
All right, we're in verse 28, chapter 18. Read as
Right.
far as you want to.
Okay. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king, then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." I'm good.
Thank you. Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" And that's the end of that section right there. Because it moves right into the sentencing. You notice that John speeds through the Jewish trial, but spends a long time here in the trial before Pontius Pilate. Spends a long time. Breaks down, actually this scene goes over in 19 to verse 16. The Jews are demanding Jesus' death. They cannot enter Pilate's headquarters because it's the Passover. They want to be able to eat the Passover. It's the Hagigah meal, a morning meal. The actual Passover meal was the night before, so the meal noted here is the Hagigah, a morning meal that would have been celebrated on the morning shortly after this trial. Every meal during this 7-day celebration was a Passover meal. So any uncleanness at all, whether 1-day or 7-day defilement, would render full participation in the festival impossible. Yeah, go ahead.
The trial they had before Caiaphas
Yeah.
was actually against the law because it was done at night.
Yes, sir.
So,
It
I
was.
mean, they weren't
Mm-hmm.
worried about being able to eat the meal, but they didn't worry about.
They didn't worry about that, did they? That's right. That's absolutely right. But if you notice, Pilate has to repeatedly go out to them and come back to Jesus. And go out to them and come back. It must have really frustrated him to no end. Jesus, he begins with a formal question. He wants to know, what is it? What have you done? And in the Jewish authorities, they say, well, look, if he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him here. They're kind of insolent and rude, wanting something from him. They may have had a preliminary agreement with him, and they just expected him to rubber stamp their judgment and order the execution. So when he asks for charges, it's kind of like, what? Why? But they don't have a formal charge, so sarcastically, Pilate tells them to take him yourself and judge him by your own law. But he just wanted them to go away. And if a Jewish trial were held, you have to have the Romans agree. They would not allow the Jews to carry out the death penalty. So they're flushed out. They admit their tricky legal situation. They just want to see him dead. And the thing to remember here is that God is in control, even over the decisions by Jesus' enemies. This was to show what kind of death Jesus would die. All right. And then we have the questions of Pilate. are you the king of the Jews? Right? And so Jesus, instead of answering it like he like he always seems to do, did you, is that what you believe, or did somebody say that about me? And he goes, am I a Jew? Right? I mean, how in the world, you know, if it is Pilate's idea, Jesus can probe as to whether Pilate perceives him as a threat and instruct him more deeply. If it comes from the Jews, as Jesus suspects, then he's just being antagonistic. And it stems from the leader's misconception of the true nature of Jesus' kingship. They just didn't understand. He's irritated. All right, in Greek, his question, am I a Jew? A little bit of Greek will do you. Begins with meti, which expects a negative answer, which basically translated is, I'm not a Jew, am I? Right? It's clear he has no personal interest whatever in this matter. What have you done? All right. But Pilate is just mystified by this because clearly you look at Jesus, he's no military man. He's no insurrectionist. But Pilate wants to know, what has he done? All right. He has to answer. He knows how to answer. And then he says, my kingdom is not of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom. It's no threat to Rome. Pilate may have thought he had lost his mind, but he knew Jesus posed no danger to Rome. Right? So we get on down here. You know, he says, if it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest. Pilate knows Jesus has simply surrendered himself without a fight. In one sense, Peter did try to start a fight, but Pilate would have been aware from his soldiers that Jesus had told him to put away his sword. Jesus is a ruler at a totally different level, and his disciples function at that otherworldly level and not as a political or military rebel, right? So Pilate recognizes Jesus as making a royal claim. You are a king then. So you say, is what Jesus says. Some commentators translate this, king is your word, not mine. But that isn't quite right either. The NIV is close. You say that I am the king. Right? So he knew he came to the world to be the Messiah, of course. Of course. And he is characterized as truth. And that leads to Pilate's question. What is truth, right? And he doesn't even give Jesus a chance to respond. We all want to know what Jesus said, but it turns out that once he says it, he turns around and dismisses Jesus' offer. He leaves the praetorium and he goes outside to address the Jews. Okay? So he knows Jesus poses no threat. But this reply is justly famous, and it's the heart cry of all seekers of truth. With this, John asks his readers to search their hearts for any openness to truth. I think we're going to get through this chapter. I think. So let me finish that last paragraph. And gosh, that's going to be all we can do. All right, we'll get through the rest of it, maybe. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? They shouted in reply, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a bandit. Okay? So that is where this chapter ends. We're in the middle of the trial before Pilate. Bar-Abba, son of the father, is what Barabbas' name means. And it's interesting, because we're going to have Jesus, Bar-Abba, son of the father, capital F, and Barabbas, son of the father. And you got your choice. And which one will the people choose? And this sets us up for the rest of the scene here for chapter 19. So I don't know that we'll get through all. We may skip 20. No, we won't skip. Yeah, we may skip 19. I'll try to get us through it next week. But if we don't, hopefully, Lord willing, I'll have other opportunities to dig into this. But okay, so That is Jesus getting from the upper room in front of Pilate. It's all happening within a matter of hours, and it won't be long before he'll find himself on a Roman cross. And we'll get to that. We'll have to talk about the timing of that, because in John's gospel, it's the 6th hour, which is noon. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is 9 a.m., the 3rd hour. We'll have some conversation about what might or might not be going on there. But I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Obi. And thank you for anyone who will be streaming this. I appreciate you very much, and look forward to concluding our time together next week with this study before our summer break. So everybody take care. God bless, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye.